Greetings! Today we're talking about introductions. Before I actually go into what I'm looking for in your introductions, let's talk about what makes introductions effective. Let's think about some of the greatest introductions in books, in movies, in television, in presentations, in videos. What is it about these introductions that captures our attention, that gets us engaged, that makes us want to watch more, read more, play more? What is it that makes an introduction effective? What seminal elements does an introduction need to have? Today on Introductions. Introductions! Carol Clark in the book Praxis, which many of your peers have to read for their 1310s, says that introductions to your essay is an invitation to your reader. And I like that idea of inviting your reader to come inside and have a seat and get comfortable. Let me bring you a drink. I want you to be ready for what I'm about to tell you. Today we're going to talk about how the beginning of our work colors and shapes what's to come thereafter. The function of introduction is to capture your reader's interest. We live in a chaotic world, multimedia constantly hollering for our attention. There's Twitter and Snapchat and YouTube all vying for us. And that's ignoring our Xbox and PlayStation and computers. And oh, what about our work and family and friends? What are we having for dinner tonight? What movie should I take my date out this weekend? That is constantly barraging our senses. And an introduction to a piece has to somehow say, stop, pay attention to me. These first few sentences have to get the audience so motivated that this piece is worth paying attention to, that the audience tunes out the rest. An introduction also needs to set up an audience for success by offering seminal background information and, of course, offering the overarching aim as well as forecast, which we're going to call a thesis. How much background, however, is very context specific. Years ago, I had a student writing a piece on robotic surgery, and in this paper, I questioned whether or not he is right, who his audience is. Because if he's writing to doctors, specifically surgeons, then all he needs to really flesh out is the minutia of what a robot brings to the table versus a doctor. However, if you're talking to a patient who's considering going under the knife, you might need to actually flesh out, or the student had to flesh out what it was that the surgery entailed and sort of the cost-benefit analysis of what a robot versus a doctor does to this particular procedure. There are 4 seminal elements to an introduction. Now, on the assignment sheet, I conflate the bottom 2 into one, which I call the thesis. However, I want to piecemeal out those first 2 in a little more depth. The first thing you have to have in the very first sentence in your piece, you need to offer up a hook. I love that violent imagery because a hook has to aggressively grab your readers by the throat and say, pay attention to me. A hook can be a dramatic vignette, a startling fact or statistic, an arresting quotation, an interesting scene, or something else that traps your reader's attention. Again, that violent, aggressive metaphor needing to underscore how important that opening line is to get the audience engaged. We're going to talk more about those on the next slides. Background information. Now, background information is lots of things. Definition of terms, summary of events leading up to the problem, factual details for the basic understanding of the issue. Now, one of the things I'm looking for in this paper is I need the introduction in the background to offer what texts you're going to be analyzing. Recall that you have 4 texts, of which you have to choose 2, 3, or 4 of them to do a rhetorical analysis of. So in this paper, you're going to have to actually, in the introduction, explain, I am looking at Gloria Anzaldua's How to Tame a Wild Tongue and Richard Rodriguez's Aria, Memoir of a Bilingual Childhood. Now, what I also would like you to do is to flesh out the minutiae at work. Turn to the works cited in the Language Acts, and you'll notice that Anzaldua piece is from her book, Borderlands, while Rodriguez's piece is actually a scholarly essay scholarly article published in the American Scholar Journal. Those are very different genres, and that may factor into your audience's understanding of the differences of these pieces. So offer them in that background. Let your audience know this so that they're set up for success. A book, a New York Times bestselling book like Borderlands, likely has a very different audience than a scholarly peer-reviewed article like the American Scholar. And because we're dealing with pathos, it could be a really good point of discussion when figuring out exactly who our intended audience is and how pathos is elicited from these audience. The next part is the thesis, part 1 and 2. We have to lay out our aim, our analytical aim that expresses what it is this essay is actually doing, why it's valuable, why it's meaningful, what you want your readers to take from it. Perhaps it's best to think of the aim part of the thesis as the elevator speech. Let's say you have a sentence, and in this sentence, you have to encapsulate the entire 5 to 6 page essay you're writing. That's your thesis. It is your entire piece broken down to one seminal argument that you can offer to your audience. One analysis that says this here is everything in this paper in a nutshell. Students are pretty good at that. The part that many students struggle with is the next part, the preview of the whole. The one thing immediately following the thesis, but before body paragraphs, is offering this preview, telescope, roadmap, forecast. It lays out the organization of this essay. In this paper, I'm talking about A, then I'm talking about B, or I'm talking about A and B and C, or A and B and C and D. Whatever the organization of your paper needs to be mirrored in that last sentence, the introduction. This does several things. First and foremost, it actually creates your own ethos because you made a promise and you followed through. You're an honorable person and a better writer. It also is logos because logos is at its core organization, and you have created an organization and you've represented this organizational scheme at the beginning of your piece, and then you followed it through in the actual paper proper. It also offers a higher degree of success. There are a lot of things not to do, but here's probably the big 3 in the introduction. Don't offend your audience. Introductions are places where we're getting to know you, getting to know all about you. Think about when you first met your boyfriend or girlfriend. On your first date, were you your full self, or were you sort of that expert, perfect version of yourself that wore off as time with your relationship went on? That's what we're doing here. The introduction, you don't want to scare them off. You don't want to offend them. You want to take it and be fair and balanced and likable. As we go through your essay, as your audience follows through, they will start deciding, oh yeah, I like this person. I'm going to go ahead and actually listen to you. Go ahead and inject some stronger opinions in the conclusion. But don't piss off your audience in the get-go. Don't bore your reader to death either. It is so easy to get tedious and obnoxious and just monotonous and make your reader want to go on. Also, don't sound like a know-it-all. You aren't the end-all, be-all. You are intelligent, informed, collegiate students performing a rhetorical analysis of a piece, and that is a worthwhile cause, but you are not the end-all, be-all biographer of these authors. So be yourself, not a know-it-all. So we're going to look at hooks now. We're going to look at that opening scene because they're incredibly important to the piece. We're going to offer up 4 main hooks that work well for this upcoming assignment. The first is beginning with a quotation from an interesting person or text related to your topic. The easiest way of going about this and making it so you don't have to actually cite outside research is just to pull a quote from one of these authors. You have 4 to work with. They have some great pieces, great insights that you're not going to end up probably referencing in your paper proper. So why not offer them as a quotation to set the audience in motion? Begin with an interesting fact from one of the texts. There's those introductions to each piece which offers background on these characters, on these people, and on their lives. Offer something fascinating about them. It needs to be short. Begin with a rhetorical question. Get your audience thinking about what you want to get into the minutia by asking them a question. Or begin with a short narrative or anecdote that connects you directly to this piece, how you are related to it. Each of these has pros, but each of these has cons. Let's unpack them. First, we're taking on quotations, as if taking on a bear. As Gloria Anzaldúa once observed, wild tongues can't be tamed, they can only be cut out. The metaphor perfectly encapsulates both her experience and the similar experience of Mary Crow Dog as they attended English-speaking schools. There are a couple of dangers here. First, it's really easy to use great authors like a crutch, overshadowing your own ideas. Amy Tan is a New York Times best-selling author whose book is so good it's been turned into a Disney movie. That's hard to have to offer up your own words against. She's an accomplished writer. So is Anzaldúa. So is Crow Dog. These are all published writers who have done well for themselves, and saying that somehow we can be in the same field as they are is often intimidating. So students use quote after quote after quote after quote, hoping that by offering the great words of others, somehow I'm magically making my own writing better. Don't do that. These are excerpts that we're looking at the rhetorical situation of. We're looking specifically at the pathos. You gotta offer the quote. You gotta tell us what it means. This paper is mostly you. Second, quotes can be taken out of context. It would be incredibly easy for me to take excerpts from, let's say, Rodriguez and argue that how much he's lost by having his private familial language drowned out by the public English, that it would be easy to say he's all for bilingual education, but he's not. And saying that Rodriguez wants bilingual education undercuts everything he's arguing for. How about an interesting fact? While most people have only one name, Mary Crow Dog has several, including Mary Bravebird and Mary Ellen Moore Richard, reflecting Crow Dog's complex cultural and racial background. This multi-nominal experience means Crow Dog. That's fascinating. I want to know more about that paper. She does have different names. I wonder why. The problem here is this is letting your introduction begin to turn into a body paragraph. Look, well, most people have one name. Mary Crow Dog has several. Main idea, evidence. Mary Bravebird. Here's this quote from Denise Garrett that's offering Mary Ellen Moore Richards. And that right there is then followed up with analysis. This multimodal experience means Crow Dog. That sounds like a meal body paragraph, and that gets dangerous. You got about 2 sentences to get your fact out there, and then you got to move on. Rhetorical questions. Is bilingual education a good thing? In Aria, Memoir of a Bilingual Childhood, Richard Rodriguez highlights, the concern with this strategy is that you invite your audience to decide how they feel about a subject before you had a chance to persuade them to your way of thinking. So imagine if I'm trying to argue in this piece that ultimately Rodriguez's pathos is connected to his audience being persuaded that bilingual education is in fact bad. But imagine that they think it's a good thing. And I say, is it a good thing? You're like, yep. And I'm like, no, it's a bad thing. I'm going to show you Rodriguez and how he tries to elicit his pathos in an audience to convince it it's a bad thing. And by that, I've already ruined my audience forever. I have to, the rest of the paper is just undoing the damage I created in the first opening line. Personal narratives. How vividly I remember my mom trying to explain in her broken English how eating cow brains make you smart. Similarly, Amy Tan, our own stories are never as interesting to others as they are to us. We sit there and we listen to each other only because the other person will shut up and I'll get a chance to tell my story. It's very much like Brian Miller was talking about, our magician from a few weeks ago, that we don't listen. We wait anxiously to throw our own ideas in. Unless you can convincingly tie yourself into the project, tell a story about someone else, and bring yourself in later. Conclusions are a good place for personal interjection, but more on that next unit. Choose wisely. There are a few of the hooks that exist. There's so many more. You can start with the opposite opinion. You can offer the dictionary definition. You can offer an interesting scene or even a joke. But all of these have cost benefits. So let's take opposite opinion. If you can't say something nice about your opponent, you've belittled part of your audience and you've lost them. You dictionary definition. How formulaic is that? An interesting scene. Okay, maybe, but is it actually connected? Does it actually work? And last but not least, a joke. Incredibly engaging, but seems like maybe you're not taking the topic seriously enough. They all have advantages, they all have disadvantages. Select a hook that introduces your topic. So let's get to the thesis portion. What is your point? What are you trying to do? So these are the types of theses offered by the Online Writing Lab at Purdue. First and foremost is an analytical paper which breaks down an issue or idea into its component parts. It evaluates the issue and ideas and presents the breakdown and evaluation to the audience. Next, we have an expository or explanatory paper that explains something to an audience. And last, we have an argumentative paper which makes a claim about a topic and then justifies the claim with specific evidence. The claim should be an opinion, a policy proposal, an evaluation, a cause and effect statement, or an interpretation. The goal is to convince your audience that you're right. Even if you're not doing this, even if you're not telling a story like that, you got, let's say, a narrative, it's still good to have something within the first paragraph or first page that outlines the general consensus of this piece. Let's go back to Rodriguez. In his end of his introduction, he says, "It is not possible for a child, any child, ever to use his family's language in school." That is his ultimate thesis for this piece, even though the essay itself is much more of a narrative. This assignment, you are writing a rhetorical analysis. As such, you need to have an analytical thesis. You have to break down the rhetoric, specifically the pathos and pathomata at work in these readings, and then express this to your audience. Your thesis should be specific. It should only cover what we are going to discuss in this paper and nothing more. The thesis should usually appear at the end of the introduction. This is one of those things I've gotten really good at looking for. I know when authors have shifted to body paragraphs because suddenly we're specifically looking at a line from the text and here's what it means. We're getting very specific, so I know that we're in the body. When I see that, I look up to the very end of the paragraph above it, and that's where I want to see theses. The very last line of the introduction, that's where I want to see the aim and the forecast. Your topic will change. It does happen. As we write, we learn. As we learn, we revise. When you revise your paper, make sure you're revising your thesis and introduction to actually totally reflect what you're doing, especially the forecast. Students start cutting and pasting because we live in this great world of the computer where we can cut and paste and move things around. But sometimes students don't remember to go back to the introduction and then fix that to actually mirror. That's why I suggest writing theses and introductions last, because typically we don't know what we're going to introduce until we've actually written the rest of it. Let's take a second and look at some of the reading. How did each author introduce his or her work to his audience? Let's think about Gloria Anzaldúa. Anzaldúa set us up by actually offering that great dentist piece. How wonderful it was and how vivid to have this dental scene that really captured our attention and got us into her piece. Contrast that with Crow Dog, who starts with this quote from the Department of the Interior about Native Americans. How perfect is that to hook the audience and get them geared up for what's to come? Think about how each author engages his or her readers. And in Crow Dog's case, we know his or her readers are a sympathetic white audience because she says that from her first sentence. What hook did he or she utilize? What background did he or she offer? And what did the author of this piece, what did this author offer of his or her overall argument? We are about to get into our workshop, so this is the time to ask questions. Please remember to call me, email me, tweet at me, or come to my office in Columbine Hall. Make sure we're on the same page. And in fact, I'm thinking I'm going to move to Skype next week. More of that on announcement. Thanks for listening.